Good evening, all of you, Indian Standard Time. So others can substitute the time of your day. So it gives us great pleasure to invite you all to attend this great, dial-in program or a Zoom call. So we have this great opportunity of Mr. Ajit Menon being with us to address and see how the markets are going to go from here. What are the things that we need to worry about, whether there's something really serious to be worried about, what are the things that are going to change. So before we set going and not taking much of your time, I'll just give a brief introduction about Mr. Ajit, though I know it's a very small introduction, not keeping in stature with what he has achieved. So Mr. Ajit Menon is the Chief Executive Officer of Pramerica Asset Management India. As the CEO, Mr. Ajit oversees all aspects of asset management business, including mutual fund and portfolio management services. Mr. Ajit is responsible for the direction of the business and growth strategy, which kind of is his core area. And as a dynamic and result-oriented leader, he brings to the table a keen analysis, insights, and a team approach to the organizational improvement and implementation of the best practices. So as an industry veteran, Mr. Ajit has over 2 decades of leadership experience in business strategy, distribution, sales, and marketing. And prior to Pramerica, he was with Tata Asset Management Company, where he was head of strategy. And prior to that, Mr. Ajit spent close to 15 years with DSP, BlackRock, where he played a key role in the growth of their business. He is also associated with the key industry bodies and a sought-after speaker. You will know that in a few minutes now, from now. And has addressed various domestic forums and conferences. And interestingly, he has authored papers on matters pertaining to asset management business, and he has co-designed a 6-month certification course in wealth management and a 2-month retirement readiness certification course for business partners. So that's Mr. Ajit Menon for you. I pass on the forum to you.
Thank you.
Welcome home, sir, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Ishwar, for that kind introduction. All of these kind words are written on my website and my LinkedIn for, various reasons. But let me tell you that, my experience of 26 years tells me that, at least whatever experts and fund managers are thinking right now, a lot of them are literally speculating and just doing a lot of things by trial and error. And, because there is so much of news out there from, newspapers and WhatsApp and things like that, it's very easy to get distracted. And I think that just using our common sense sometimes is useful enough for us to, get by the day. But what I'm going to do today is, in the time that we have, is going to share with you certain perspectives that I get from Prudential, which is our parent. PGIM stands for Prudential Global Investment Managers. And this is a 140-year-old organization. It's the Prudential of the US. There is also another Prudential of the UK, which is known here in India, with the joint ventures with ICICI. So ICICI Prudential is the UK Prudential, and Prudential Global Investment Managers, which is PGIM, that is us, is the US Prudential, the much larger. There's no relation, obviously, between the two. We are technically, as a brand, the largest brand currently in India. Globally, we manage about $1.4 trillion of investments. And we have about 1,200 asset managers, or rather fund managers, all around the world, who's been feeding us some interesting perspectives, in the last 2 months. And I'm hoping to share some of those perspectives with you. I am very well aware that today, for most people, you must take all experts or so-called experts with a pinch of salt. Because honestly, nobody really knows how things are going to pan out over the next 3-6 months or the next 1 or 2 years. Everybody is speculating a bit. But what we are trying to do here is not really talk of just possibilities that might occur, but more probabilities. What are the probabilities of certain things happening or not happening? And I think that if we can think about those probabilities, we will be able to make some common sense decisions about our portfolio, about our investments, and the things we need to do. So it is probabilities based on the things that I will be sharing with you today that I think you should take this presentation. In terms of the agenda, I do want to talk about the politics around the world, certain perspectives from PGIM, the India issues, the Indian response in market perspectives, investor perspectives, and certain conclusions. I must say that much of this is coming from the fund managers that we have, also with trustees and board members who've been part of the government in India earlier in their earlier avatars. So we get some good perspectives from what they're thinking, journalists and advisors as well. Now, you must be thinking why we should be talking about politics, when we are thinking about investments and what we need to do as investors. There is a reason why we should be thinking about politics first. And that, I believe, is because the economic machine is always more powerful than the political system in the long run. But the political system's interaction with the economic cycle is what drives everything in the short run. And the reason why a lot of things are currently unpredictable is because we don't know what the nature of those reforms are likely to be and what that impact will happen in the short and medium term to various companies, sectors, consumers, and everything that we know today. So, every government, every politician is out there putting out whatever they think will help their countries in terms of various measures, and they all have different impacts. Very difficult to call it in the short run, but I think that's what makes it a little unpredictable. But we must be pretty confident that the economic cycle and what will happen to the economic cycle will prevail over the longer run. Let's look at some of this in terms of the politics around the world. The first is that in this crisis, no global leader seems to have taken charge. When we saw the 2008 crisis, when we saw the SARS epidemic or the MERS epidemic, which was the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome epidemic, there was either an Obama or a G7 which took charge of the world and decided on coordinating efforts at a political level to take care of that problem. There is nobody this time. Multilateral institutions have also fallen short. When the Second World War happened in 1939, 1940 and beyond, a lot of organizations were set up. The United Nations, the World Health Organization, the IMF, the WTO. These multilateral institutions were set up with the primary responsibility of taking care of such kind of global crises. We don't hear too much about them right now in this crisis. So I think one thing about the politics is that, what we have seen in the current scenario is politicians being very narrow and selfish about what needs to be dealt with in their country, not collaborating much with countries abroad, very little. The people who are collaborating are the scientists and the academicians, including scientists from China early on in January, sending out the results of the DNA type and sequence of the virus to more than 177 labs around the world to try and figure out a vaccine for it as early as we can. And they have been sharing that information. So it's scientists and scientists are collaborating, academicians and academicians are collaborating, politicians are not collaborating. What are politicians doing and central bankers doing and regulators doing? Pretty much trial and error. Nobody in living memory has seen such a kind of crisis. You could argue that people who might have been alive during the Second World War, for instance, would have seen lockdowns happen. But those were very regional in places like Europe and not in 210 countries around the world. So a lot of the interventions and political things that are happening are a little bit of a trial and error. Some of them will help us, but there's potential for some of it to harm us as well in the medium to long term. Now, China is being pushed back by most economies and political systems around the world. I mean, one can argue that even before this crisis, China was being pushed back by the US and we had all the trade disputes happening. But that is increasing. Even in India, you saw the government release a note that said that any country that has a border with India cannot acquire any company in India automatically. They will have to go through the government route. It was basically aimed at China. Supply chain and 5G leaderships are something that we will need to be looking out for. Supply chain because 90% of the Fortune 1000 companies in the world have at least a level 1 or a level 2 supplier in China. So the kind of disruption that will do in terms of people wanting to diversify their supply chains and their manufacturing will have an impact. And 5G will rule the world in the next coming years, in the sense that Today, almost everything that we know which is electronic is run on 4G. The fight, honestly, behind many of the trade disputes that US and China were having was actually 5G. And whichever country really comes up with a stable protocol and standard on 5G can take economic leadership in the new world. So this is one war that we'll have to keep track of post this crisis as well. Many of the old issues remain. Global growth was already low before we went into this crisis. Climate change was already being fought over before we went into this crisis. Inequality is something that PGIM globally has been talking about, which is changing political systems around the world. The rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Why? Because it is the long tail of people who feel as if they have not got their rights who vote. And then you get politicians like maybe a Donald Trump, or you get situations like a Brexit, where Britishers feel that immigrants are taking away their jobs. So then those steps have to be taken. So the political systems then rule it. And we're seeing it literally all over the world. So inequality is something to think about. Even in India, it is only 1% of Indians who actually earn more than 15 lakh rupees a year. 50% of working Indians earn 5,000 rupees a month. So, what the priorities for the government is likely to be is going to be focused a lot on the bottom of the pyramid or the middle of the pyramid rather than on the top of the pyramid. Nationalism, deglobalization, global debt is a big issue. And the oil and dollar will potentially hurt some economies and help some economies. And we'll talk about that as well a little later. So what is the world looking for from a political standpoint, which is that they're looking at diversifying supply chains. They're looking for economies that can bounce back in terms of growth and productivity with relatively low debt, strong democratic and institutional frameworks to safeguard businesses, and ease of doing business. I think that if you think about your investments and your investments in India or anywhere else in the world, this is what will be the new reality that investors, big investment firms, and economies will be looking out for into the future. And what your common sense tells you about India will potentially give you much of the answers. And of course, the facts also behind what we know about India will probably give you some answers about what we should think about our investments. Now, let me tell you all the bad news that is floating around and what is really important for us to keep in mind, the issues with India. And these are important to keep in mind. One is that we have a working population of about 47 crore out of the 130 crore people that we have in India. Barring maybe some unemployed, which might take this number slightly up, it is 47 crore. But the more important part is that 83% of working Indians are either self-employed or casual labor. And therefore, the impact on them with an economic lockdown is obviously going to be quite high. And the responses, therefore, that emerging economies like India might need to do would be very different from the measures that are being taken in other parts of the world. So while we read the news, it's important for us to differentiate, because every country is really in a different place of their development and their own domestic realities. And we will have to judge the steps taken by the Indian government basis of our reality and how that will impact our investments. So I think it's very difficult to generalize the steps that one must take, one should be taking all over the world. Every country needs a good domestic savings rate. If you have a good savings rate, the government then has enough money to do what it needs to do to keep the economy chugging along. But the Indian net domestic savings rate has been falling over the last few years because wages have not been growing, and that's been an issue. The deficit of our economy will go up, which means the gap between what we earn and what we spend is going to go up, which means the government may need to borrow much more money to keep the economy going. Anytime the government comes to borrow much more, it is a negative impact on things like interest rates and inflation, and has an impact on investments. So we will have to keep track of that. Tax collections could be low, and our financial ecosystem in India has been a little weak for some time. after Raghuram Rajan came in and cleaned up the financial sector act, and especially with the banks and the non-performing assets in those banks. And we were recovering slowly, and then we had this crisis. So it's still a weak financial ecosystem, and that's important for us to keep in mind. We entered the 2008 crisis reasonably strong as an economy, and we had an indirect impact out of that crisis. In this crisis, we actually entered the crisis weak. Our growth had already dipped below 5% before even coronavirus came. And we are having a direct impact of the lockdown. If you look at factories in India, they were already operating at low capacities. The utilization was around 68%. Usually it should be about 75, 77, 80%, but it was already below 70% before the crisis. And promoters are not necessarily going to be very enthusiastic about investing money into capacities and factory building when consumer demand itself would be slightly low going forward. The most critical thing for India has been the ease of doing business, which is a big hurdle for multinational companies to come to India. All of us as investors wonder, why didn't India become the next China? What is stopping us? What is stopping us is the government rules and regulations that are unpredictable. When Nirmala Sitharaman comes and announces that any company that is putting up a factory after October 2019 will only be subject to a 15% corporate tax, pretty much like a Singapore, everybody rejoices. But what we forget is that they didn't say for how long they will charge that 15%. Will it stop the next year, the next 3 years? Or is it going to be pretty predictable that it will stay there for the next 10, 15 or 20 years? It's difficult to operate in these kind of unpredictable environments, and which is why a lot of multinational companies, even though they have been going out of China even before this crisis, actually have been going to Bangladesh and Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam and Mexico rather than coming to India. So we will have to watch out for what kind of reforms in India will actually make our rules and regulations more predictable. It is only then that we can get a lot more comfort about what growth rates we can achieve. Many sectors like real estate or auto, SMEs, airlines, telecom, they were already in a stress before this crisis. They had tightened up their belts. And therefore, in a relative sense, many were already prepared in a sense about the crisis. This is going to hurt them much more, but we will see them being a little more resilient as we come out of it. So let's see what will happen next. The issues that we will have to worry about is, what is the political fallout? What, this whole deficit issue in India, and whether international rating agencies will downgrade India. Because if they downgrade India, a lot more FIIs will take money out of India, and that has an impact on the economy and especially the markets. Currency depreciation, especially if you're an NRI and you're looking at money, should you be sending money into India much more, or should you be keeping it out? What's the outlook for depreciation of the currency? And of course, inflation. Inflation is probably the number one issue that everybody should be thinking about when you think about currencies, when you think about investments, and you think about anything else. The real heart of the matter will be, how do you predict inflation? Now, while we're talking about some of these issues, and they seem reasonably difficult issues, my sense is that when you want to think about markets and your investments, you also need to think about one critical factor, which is flows. In the shorter term, flows can dictate where the markets go. You can have the best fundamentals in the market, but with no flow, the market doesn't go anywhere. And sometimes you can have the worst fundamentals in the market, but if you get a lot of flow, the market just jumps up. And so how do you predict flows? And as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, probabilities. What is the probability that India will get flows is probably a simple question that we need to answer. And in thinking about it, we need to think about it, India relative to other countries in the world, because money is sloshing around in the world as every economy and central bank is, printing money and pumping it into the economy to revive it. That money will find a place. It's like water. And if they think that the probability of investing in India is good, that money will come into India and Indian markets, and we will not be able to predict how soon or how fast these markets will respond to it. So we have to keep those probabilities in mind. So let's look at the Indian response so far as the crisis has been concerned. I sort of like to title this, Will the Elephant Dance? It has not been dancing because of the rules and regulation more than anything else. The whole world has very good goodwill for India, but it just stops there. Goodwill. It doesn't go beyond that goodwill. It doesn't go beyond that goodwill to really investing into the country and then taking things forward. But let's look at the response that India has done so far. We did take the right decisions as far as this virus attack is concerned. The result of it is that in per million terms, because then that is comparable to all over the world, in per million terms, the Indian death rate is 1 per million. And for developed countries, it's 600 per million. That's the difference. A lot of people argue that India has not done enough testing. It's partially true. It's not completely true. If you think about the protocols of testing that has been established, whether by WHO or anybody else, if every testing kit from every testing kit manufacturer in the world was imported into India, it would not have been enough to do the testing that people talk about. So the fact that we shut down our boundaries, shut down the airlines quickly, we started self-quarantine for people who were traveling in, and finally went for a complete lockdown, is the correct series of steps that any government should have taken in this crisis, as per experts sitting all over the world. And I think this is important because when investors, large investors, and people think about putting money into an economy, they want to judge the ability and the competency of an economy in crises like this. In fact, there is a sense that Asia seems to have handled this crisis better than the Western world. All across Asia, whether it is India or South Korea or Taiwan, or for that matter, China, they have handled this crisis better than either a Europe or a US. And that's reflected in many of the numbers. We are also displaying statesmanship when it comes to a medicine called hydrochloroquine. Now, I did mention to you that governments and politicians are not collaborating, but India has actually collaborated better. This medicine called hydroxychloroquine has been found to, at least for COVID infected patients, help them either get stable or get a little better, according to a lot of reports that have been there all around the world. I'm not a health expert or a doctor, but this is what we're getting as information from a lot of people who are watching the space. And more than 30 countries requested India for this medicine for one reason. We are the world's largest producer of hydrochloroquine. 70% of the world's production happens in India. Unfortunately, an API or an active pharmaceutical ingredient that's required to make this medicine is imported from China, and we had sealed our borders and flights. So India opened up a dedicated flight corridor from China, imported the API, manufactured the medicine, and exported it across the world, including the US. I believe that this would, at the very minimum, win brownie points for India as we think about trade negotiations and how this Indian economy will be perceived and also be invested into by many other countries and many other people who are watching how economies perform. We have a federal structure. It could be a bane or a boon for business. What I mean by that is we are like the US. We have 29 states in India. And every state is behaving differently in this crisis because every chief minister believes that it is going to be reflected in their next elections. The center knows it, the BJP knows it, Prime Minister knows it, and they're collaborating a lot with the states right now rather than taking unilateral decisions. When the lockdown decision of March 24th was taken in India, it was pretty much a unilateral decision. But when on April 14th, they decided to extend the lockdown, it was only after the Prime Minister had done a video call with every chief minister in the country. So collaboration is beginning to happen at that level. And 29 states will react very differently in the months and years ahead, which you will have to watch out for. Kerala and Karnataka handled this crisis very well. Maharashtra and Gujarat handled it very badly. And we have production centers in Maharashtra and Gujarat. So how your business performs might also have a link in which state you are and what kind of steps and protocols those states follow in India. It's like in the US, 50 states, each of them compete for each other, whether the Google campus should come into their state or the Facebook office should open up in their state. And remember that land and labor are state issues. Remember that the police and the administration report into the state. So in a situation like this, the control is with the state more than the center, even though the Epidemics Act allows the center to do a lot of things. But how each state behaves will have an impact on businesses going forward. And I feel that the competition, maybe I'm an optimist, but I feel that the competition that will come up between the states in India is going to be positive for businesses going forward. India is already blessed with the fact that we are now having low interest rates. It's always good for business to, borrow and spend, or, start factories or do whatever business. Of course, people are not doing it right now, but it's likely to remain low for a long time, and interest rates are low all across the world. Oil prices have come off significantly, which is always good for India. But please remember that oil price, as a lot of people believe is good for India if the price comes down, is a wrong perspective to have. Oil price going too low is bad for India simply because there are so many of us Indians who work in oil economies around the world, like many of you probably who have joined this call. And remittances are very, very important for India. And if oil price goes down to a point where these economies have problems, then obviously it's going to impact Indians working in those economies and therefore remittances into the country. So oil price going too low is not good for India. Oil price going too high is not good for India. It has to remain in a sort of Goldilocks situation of $30 to $40. Saudi Arabia is probably the only country which probably has a cost of production around $10 and can sustain itself for much longer, not for many other economies. And therefore, oil price is an important thing to watch out for. At this point of time, on a net basis, it looks like it's good for India. We also got to remember that we do a lot of petroleum exports from India. And when crude prices drop, the prices that you can achieve or get on these petroleum exports also drop. So we have to be positive on a net basis. And we are positive on a net basis in this crisis. So that's helpful. Supply chain redistribution will probably help us. As I mentioned, China is the factory of the world. And if you have to diversify your factories out of China in a much larger way compared to the trickle that was happening over the last 3-5 years already, then there is only one country in the world which has a working population in the English language that can absorb that kind of manufacturing capacity, and that's India. But as I mentioned earlier, the rules and regulations and reforms is what we will need to watch out for from the political system. We also have a young workforce which is more resilient to a pandemic kind of an issue. We have seen this affect places like Europe much more badly because of the age factor that plays through in this kind of infections. So for India, there are certain things that from a probability perspective, I think are positive. We are a country which has low debt to GDP. We are not the best, but we are somewhere in the middle from an emerging economy perspective, and that's good. The US probably has debt to GDP at a ratio of more than 250%. China is about that percentage. Japan is about that percentage, but it's very different for developed countries. You cannot compare that with India. Our debt to GDP is currently about 56%, which is very good. It may go up to 70-75%, which is still not bad compared to many other economies in the world. And therefore, I think that this might be a factor that economists around the world will watch out for and possibly will be a positive or a neutral factor at least for India. The central bank reserves are good. So if you compare India to a house and the banker of the house or the person, if it's one house and the central bank is the banker to the nation, we have $487 billion in the central bank. And that's a positive because if you think about the requirements that India has to sort of spend on whatever we import, whether they are electronics or oil or gold and various other things that are required for India, fertilizers and things like that, we have enough money to last us more than 12 months in this crisis. And that is a very big positive for an economy when investors are looking at the economy. In fact, our external sector part of India is looking good. It's the internals which are slightly weak when it comes to the financial system and things like that, which are important. We have good food reserves. The Food Corporation of India has around 70 million tons of food grains in the warehouses. Maybe we should not debate whether all of that will reach where it has to reach and whether things will get spoiled or not. But 70 million tons is a lot. India will probably require about 20-25 million tons to make sure that nobody goes hungry. So we have enough food reserves, and that security is good. And rural India has not been affected so much in this particular crisis. So if you think about rural India, you see that the farmers, because they are staying in the villages, and we know it, that social distancing is already there. The infection impact has been higher in densely populated cities and towns. And 70% of Indians depend on the agricultural sector. You can understand now why the government wants to focus on them much more, because, well, you're covering a large voting base if you're doing all the right things for them. But just thinking about it is a positive, because if 70% of India is not much affected by this coronavirus, and the agricultural sector is resilient because of this, then at least the rural demand will be a positive factor when other people are looking at how the Indian economy is going to bounce back and how they're going to do. Even though it's a small part of the economy right now, it will be a positive. So these are positives for India. And if you also see in India, because of demonetization and GST, many, many companies have already tightened their belt. So in a relative sense, there is actually resilience amongst the Indian corporates if you compare it to many other economies. Think about a Thailand. We think about Bangkok and various, touristy places. That whole economy, that whole country depends on tourism. And with, flights and social distancing and issues, you can imagine the impact that it will have on an economy that's fully dependent on something like that. Fortunately, India is not in that space, but I'm just giving it to you as a relative measure. And a lot of investors, big international investors, pension funds, the big money, will think about all of these factors when they think about bringing money back. The issue that we will obviously, as a risk, need to keep in mind is all the policy related things which I spoke about earlier. Very difficult to say how those things will play out. But land, labor, and capital, they need resolution from the government of India. And I think that we will probably see a lot more there. Let's look at some market perspectives to go with it now. And as I mentioned to you, the probabilities of flow in the short term and factor reforms, factor just being land, labor, and capital, which is basic to economics, whatever reforms happen there is going to give longer term direction. Let's look at it first that China returned to 90-95% normalcy in 3 months from lockdown. Prudential has a very large office in China, and my colleagues had come back to the office in the first week of April. Wuhan and Hubei province, when they were shut down in the middle of January, they were opened up 100% by first week of April. That's 3 months from lockdown. India started the lockdown on March 24th. April, May, June. If you want to put a probability, I would put the probability by late June, early July, Indian economy will be back 90% from where it was. It may not get to 100%, but it'll probably be 90% because we did take as much strong measures like China has taken. I agree that maybe I may be wrong in some percentage here or there. I agree that it's very difficult probably to put this, but I think that if you want to stick your neck out and take a call, I do think that this is a probability one can think about when you're thinking about, oh, when is the economy going to come back? Because that's going to matter a lot for markets and our investments and everything else as well. The central bank, as I mentioned, has enough reserves. It's ample. We also have, on top of the $487 billion sitting with the Reserve Bank of India, we have another $70 billion as a dollar line, swap line with Japan, which is a friendly country to India. We have used it many times in the past. 90% of the trade in the world happens in the dollar. And that's why this is very important for a country to have, to be resilient and to attract flows. Food Corporation of India, I said, has enough reserve. Oil price, on the net basis will be good. Rural India has not been affected, as I mentioned. Many industries have tightened it. Many factories have been built for domestic specifications and now have shifted to international specifications already in India. Now, whether you look at the auto sector, whether you look at the telecom or the electronic sector, in India, when multinational companies put up their factories, they were thinking about the Indian demand first. So you had those small button phones to cater to Indian demand. But many of those factories already, some years ago, have transitioned into international specifications for manufacturing all their goods. That's a big positive, because we could be an economy that will open up faster than many of the Western economies will open up, which means that production lines will go online, and a lot of competition which will be watching other companies with their production lines will probably think about also having facilities in India going forward. So it's a positive, and it is something to think about. And of course, I talked about the risks, which is, the financial sector handling or attracting foreign capital or downgrade. So a bit of a repetition again to make sure that we understand what the market perspective is going to be. Let's look at the investment and the investor perspectives a little bit over here. And how can we manage our own expectations? The first thing is that 100% normalcy will only happen if there is 100% vaccine that is well distributed. And even though we might be reading things like Moderna has got, a vaccine that seems to be working, or the US seems to have said something, or Israel seems to have said something, protocols for bringing vaccines into the market are extremely, extremely strict. It cannot be based on 8 tests or 26 tests. It needs a lot more. And 18 months is an optimistic time because of the great strides in technology and artificial intelligence and things like that. Maybe testing can be speeded up, but it could still be 12 months away before a vaccine which works 100% is distributed all around the world. It is not just important that the vaccine is discovered, and it's going to take time. So 100% normalcy to markets should be expected only much later, but you could get 90% normalcy much earlier, like I mentioned earlier. And remember that investment markets, equity markets, can respond much faster than the economy picks up. So it's important to stay invested in the market and not try to second guess that, maybe there's going to be a second wave of infection and the market will correct some more. So let me sit on the sidelines and I will invest when the market goes down again, and then I will make better returns. It's correct. It's logical to think that way. I don't deny it. But please remember that 70% of the equity trading in the world these days are happening because of algorithms and machines and machine learning, not by people. These are machines that go at such microseconds in terms of trading that a blip in price or a blip in news, and they will take the market up or down. The reason why global markets fell so fast in such a short time is because of this algorithm trading. If you're going to be sitting out of the market, before you know it, on the basis of small pieces of news, this market would have run away so much that it would have been difficult for you to catch it. So better to stay invested in the market, but for incremental money, to trickle it into the market over a 6-month period or something like that is a better strategy to do, rather than trying to second guess it and say, let us redeem, let us stay outside. There will definitely be a W, L, U, V, all these alphabets that experts talk about. Stay invested. Portfolios are good. One of the things that Prudential can see is that all the portfolios that were doing well before the crisis are going to be the same portfolios that are largely going to do good even when this crisis is over or is getting normal. Why is that? Because even before the crisis, good quality companies had higher valuation, strong balance sheets, positive cash flow, good governance, 5 or 6 or 7 companies in a sector. These were the people getting the money all over the world, including in India. These were just representative of good quality. And even after this crisis, if there are going to be structural changes, these strong companies are the ones which are going to gain market share again. So it is not going to be difficult to think about portfolios. Stay invested in the portfolios that you are. In India, There are 4,700 companies in the equity market, with more than 2,300 companies being traded on a regular basis. But the entire mutual fund industry is invested in just 141 stocks. Now you might think, oh my God, such concentration. But please remember that the Nifty 50 in India is 80% of the market capitalization of the country. So that's the best quality that you can get. Companies that will possibly grow at a higher rate than what the economy will grow. So these 141 companies are good quality companies found by fund managers across mid-cap portfolios, small-cap portfolios, large-cap portfolios. So do not worry about the quality of the companies. They are good because they are concentrated. There might be some changes, obviously, that one will have to do based on the various structural behavioral changes that might happen to consumers, but some of them can be, thought about through common sense. Multiple sources of income will be very important for your future preparedness. Let's forget about coronavirus for a moment. Let's start thinking about what's going to be the next crisis. Is it going to be a currency crisis? Is it going to be some other crisis that we didn't think about? How do we prepare for this now instead of waiting for it? And I think the answer is that, you have to think about having multiple sources of income in whatever business that you are. Today in a house, if both the husband and wife are earning, they are less anxious than a house where only one person is earning, because they're worried about their job, they're worried about the economy. But in a house where two people are working, that anxiousness is a little lesser. So having multiple sources of income from your investments, income from your job, income from what you can think about if you're a businessman, is important to think about to be prepared for the future. The other thing is about the quality of diversification. What Prudential believes is that there are 7 asset classes to invest in: equity, fixed income bonds, gold and precious metals, other commodities, currency, real estate. And then many high net worth customers invest in things like paintings and wine and antiques. It's a good, these are legitimate investments that people make. So even if we don't think about those paintings and things like that, there are 6 asset classes: equity, fixed income, gold and precious metals, other commodities, currency, real estate. How well you're diversified across these 7 asset classes, and how deep you're invested in each of them is what is going to actually matter. Which means that as long as you have advice on asset allocation, you're probably in the 1% of the world who's very ready to take care of this crisis and crises in the future. So the asset allocation advice, the asset allocation in your portfolio, the ability to diversify yourself in that portfolio is what is important. Not just large cap or mid cap equities, but also international equities might be an important way to think about it. Today, the Indian stock market is $2 trillion in size. The global equity market is $86 trillion in size. Having some percentage of allocation to these international stocks, like some of you would already be having it, or most of you would already be having it, is good. Because during these times, the companies and the themes that are growing very well for the future may not be present in the Indian stock market. Today in a lockdown, as we are all in India sitting, or whether you're in the Gulf for that matter, you're watching Netflix, you're watching Amazon Prime, you're watching, you're making online payments. Some of these stocks are not listed in the Indian stock market. They're listed in the international stock markets. So thinking about your asset allocation, thinking about the fact that don't worry about headlines, don't worry about where the index is going. You are buying a business. When you buy a portfolio, or you buy 4 portfolios of a mutual fund or whatever, you are buying the individual businesses in the portfolio. And all that you need to think about is those individual businesses. If they're decent, good, they are, low debt companies. What is the overall quality of the portfolio? Is there too much of duplication within my portfolios? Is there too much concentration in my portfolios? That's where an advisor comes in, and I know Purple Pond, and I know, what work happens at Purple Pond, and I'm very, very, happy to say that I've very rarely seen the ability to put a lot of intelligence into risk management of portfolios, which is good as we go forward. Equity will remain the ultimate asset class in an asset allocation. And the reason for it is that PGIM in 2018 did a study going back 70 years in the world and trying to look for events which disrupted the markets badly from 9% to 30%. They found 27 such events, and they found that the markets took an average of 7 months to come back to normal. Now, some may take longer, some may take shorter, because when we talk about averages, we must be careful. 7 months was the average. But I think an important observation was that whenever markets went down more than 20% or economies went down badly, the next 3-5 years sees a surge in innovation in every sector in the world. Any sector you can pick up, from chemicals to technology to pharma to electronics, you will see more innovation happen in the next 3 to 5 years. When human beings are put to the test, they innovate out of that problem. And therefore, the one asset class that captures the profits that will come out of those innovation is the equity asset class. It doesn't get captured in fixed income or currency or real estate or gold and things like that. It gets captured in the equity asset class. So to think about your equity allocation, whether it is 30% of the portfolio or 80% of the portfolio, is a very individual discussion, obviously, with your advisor. But the fact is, equity is going to continue to remain an important portion. In fact, Prudential is recommending to investors that if you have a 40% allocation to equity, this is the time to increase it to 50%. This is the time to do it, because the speed at which these algorithms and machines will start taking the market up, when small bits of good news starts coming along and people are using machines to track hundreds of variables of the economies and markets to take decisions of buying, you and I don't have the capacity to do that. So this is the right time, in a sense, and one must think about it. Fixed income always carries risks. Leverage always carries risk. Debt carries risk. It's a very important part of the market. Without credit, without leverage, markets don't function. It is required. But a lot of leverage or a lot of debt can ruin countries or companies or even people. So it is important at this point of time to be very tactical and remain at the short end, and with more liquid funds where you are very sure about the safety and liquidity rather than the returns out of those portfolios. Focus more on the safety and liquidity, because while you're trying to focus on the returns, if one single company goes to default with 75% being written off, you will lose all the advantage of the return. So it is better to have safety and liquidity first rather than focus on the returns as far as fixed income is concerned. But yes, while we can think about optimistic things, we must also think about the risks. And with so much of money being printed and being spent in economies around the world, how will central banks pull all of this money back is going to be something to watch out for the future. I'm coming to the conclusions now. This is the last slide. If you have any questions, please do put it in the chat box. I'll be happy to answer it. But let me quickly take you through the conclusions. To me, there's a lot of common sense that we need to apply rather than trying to think about all the news that is hitting you all over the place. Newspapers have to sell, so they will have to sensationalize a lot of things that is happening around the place. But I think we will have to cut through this information to try and make sense about what is useful for us. So in that, I do believe that, whether you understand finance or you don't understand finance doesn't matter. If you really think with your common sense, you will start getting the answers to it. And I hope that I made a lot of commonsensical points about how innovation happens in the markets and how equity stays there. And therefore the speed of the trading that happens because of machines and why one should stay invested. These are all, once you know about it, then, you can also take some commonsensical decisions. People are not going to stop brushing their teeth and taking a bath, so FMCG products will do well. People are not going to switch off their mobile phones and not use internet, so telecom will do well. People are not going to switch off their electricity and sit in the bloody heat in their homes everywhere, so power sector will do well. People are not going to stop growing food, so agriculture and fertilizer and the chemicals will do well. Yeah, maybe you will not take an international flight in the frequency that you were taking it. You will not stay in a hotel or buy a lot of gold jewelry or luxury cars. So maybe auto and travel and airlines are sectors that we know commonsensically is not going to do well. So I think that if when one tries to, just look at it from a very more simple perspective, I think we have all the answers ourselves. So while listening to experts, including me, just, I think just take what is important and then apply your own, filters of, common sense to say, okay, does this sound logical? And does the probability of certain things happening look better or worse? And I think that we can do that. Let's look at some of these conclusions that I did. Yes, we have to worry about this whole way that economies have invented to take care of a crisis since 2008. Print and spend, print and spend. And a lot of people think maybe I should invest in gold. And, currency is going to get completely destroyed and things like that. I don't believe so. I don't think that, that's going to necessarily happen. But I do believe that asset allocation is still the answer for even that problem. So what gold you have in your asset allocation, how much exposure you have to currencies, how much exposure you have to asset classes will matter. So there are risks in the way economies and governments are dealing with this crisis, and we should be prepared for the future. How do we prepare? If there is going to be volatility, which is going to come, the simple common sense step is, how diversified are you? I told you about the 6 asset classes. Think yourself about, how, you are diversified across those asset classes, and then, take decisions. If you're well diversified, I think you don't need much to worry about. You might just need to do some tinkering on the edges. Don't try to swing too much to the left or the right. And that might just upset the whole way that your portfolio is geared for your goals that you have, because that's more important. India has many issues, and we went through all the bad news, important bad news as well. But I believe that India is positioned to get flows. And if we are positioned to get flows, then the markets will respond to it. The only gap is predictability of rules in the reforms that the government will bring in, and that will decide the future outcomes. Leverage and debt always destroys wealth faster. So having multiple sources of income, as I said, if you're a businessman or whoever you may be, is an important to remember. 100% normalcy, please expect it only 18 months out. You can get 90 to 95% normalcy by July or August, according to me, based on the examples that I talked about. Markets usually will bounce back faster than the economy will bounce back. So, economies might be slow to come out of the recession, the structural impact that has happened and things like that. But markets will respond much faster because it discounts the future. Equity will remain the ultimate asset class. I talked about innovation and how that plays into equity asset class. Think about your goals and your priorities and keep retirement as a goal, which is important in your mind. From my personal perspective, every financial goal that a person has, you can get a loan for it. But you don't get a loan for your retirement goal. If you want to send your daughter abroad for studies, if you want to marry your son off, if you want to start a business, buy a car, get a home, you can get a loan for it. Try going to your bank and asking for a loan because you don't have enough for retirement. They're not going to give it to you. There's no such product. There is reverse mortgage. But in India, the rules and regulations around reverse mortgage that, you need to have a house which is less than 15 years old, things like that. There are a little bit of issues around it. But yes, it is a legitimate tool that you can use if you know how to use it. But people don't like to give up their homes. And I do think that prioritizing around retirement and making sure that you have long-term investments in place is important. Because if you fall short of some of your goals, if you fall short of sending your child abroad for education, if you fall short of something that you require to start a business or buy a house, you can fill the gap with a loan, but you can't fill the gap of your retirement with a loan. So reordering your priorities might be important. There will be structural change in the behavior of companies, consumers, and governments. We should be ready for it. And what we have seen is that sometimes when these drawdowns happen, and severe drawdowns in the market happen, they're frequent, but they're not long lasting. And so let's hope that this one also will not last too long. As I mentioned, PGIM thinks that, there's an average of 7 months. Sometimes it can be plus or minus, but equity is still the ultimate asset class, according to me. But asset allocation and how your goals are planned around and your asset allocation is diversified is the simple one takeaway from a presentation like this. So thank you very much for the time that you spent. We almost spent 50 minutes on this. I'll be happy to take questions in the chat box. This is a quote that I like very much, that people do not decide their futures, they decide their habits, and their habits decide their futures. And when it comes to investing, our habits stop us, in terms of saving more or spending more. And I think that even in personal life or in professional life, it is important to think about, in this lockdown, what are those habits and routines that we can change for the better, that can probably help us be more resilient into the future. So let me stop the presentation.